Hi, my name is Dr. Tyler Amell. I am an occupational epidemiologist by training, so that means I specialize in population health and preventive medicine in working populations. I wear a few hats. I sit on the executive board of directors of the Work Wellness Institute. I also sit on the executive board of the National Wellness Institute. I am on faculty and the registrar at Pacific Coast University for Workplace Health Sciences. And in my free time, I am the Chief Health and Strategy Officer at MediKeeper, which is a wellness technology company. So one of the most important things to consider whenever you're developing and deploying wellness solutions is to make sure that they are responsive and meet the needs of the population. Our populations of workers have evolved tremendously over the past couple of decades. No longer will people spend their entire careers at one organization. Typically, people will spend upwards of 4 or 5 different roles and organizations that they're a part of, which is substantially different from previous generations who didn't necessarily have all that career hopping, for lack of a better term, taking place. And so with that being front and center, we know that people won't necessarily spend the same amount of time as they have historically at an organization. And we've got a different cultural and diverse makeup from the organizations today in comparison to yesterday's organizations. So a great example is we no longer have, for the most part, gender-dominated organizations. We have lots of different people participating in lots of different roles. And so what that means from a workplace health and productivity perspective is that we have to meet the needs of the organization and to meet the needs of the people through that lens. So we can't paint the same brush from a wellness perspective or a health or even a benefit perspective as we once did, where there was a one-size-fits-all program, because everybody for the most part looked the same, acted the same, and came from the same culture. That's not the case anymore. We've got very diverse cultures. We've got very diverse workforces that are made up of people from different generations, that are made up of people from different cultures. And so this melting pot comes together and it forces us to rethink how we have traditionally supported people and organizations when it comes to workplace health and productivity. So a great example is the fact that we absolutely need to personalize people's journey on their health improvement or on their journey towards health improvement. And this is quite important because if you don't personalize a program, then your engagement will not necessarily be as high as it could be, because it doesn't speak to the individual needs of people who are making up that workplace population. So by taking a diversity, equity, and inclusive perspective with regards to your wellness programming, you can tailor your approaches to make sure that they're personalized and individualized based upon gender, based upon age, based upon generation, and based upon cultural factors that make up the workplace. One of the most important things that employers today really need to consider is the fact that by 2025, approximately 65% of the workforce is going to be comprised of people who are in Gen Z and millennials. So those are people born after born after 1981. So historically, we've had baby boomers in the workplace, we've had Gen Xers, now we're getting a lot more Gen Zs and millennials in there, and of course the next generation, we actually have the opportunity to have a very diverse workforce from an age perspective. Now, as we transition from a historical approach that was dominated by one particular group, the baby boomers, into a much more diverse area, and now moving into a much more younger workforce, then our approach to well-being has to be considered somewhat differently. A great example would be the inclusive approach of supplying daycares in organizations. You know, depending on the organization, if you had a very advanced age group, you know, mean age of 55 or 60, well, that wouldn't be very appealing from a health and well-being perspective to have a daycare. But as an attraction, recruitment, and retention strategy when it comes to well-being and peace of mind and helping people to stay focused and support those sort of approaches, then absolutely, then a daycare would be a good example of a means to address perhaps mental health, stress, depression, anxiety, or burnout risk within that population, just as one particular example. So the most important take-home message when it comes to really making sure that we are addressing the diverse needs of the population is to make sure that we're considering all the different generations, all the different races, all the different cultures, and incorporating these data into the matrix to make sure that we speak to those individual needs. Another consideration for employers is really, how do we deal with work disability? Now, work disability, and from a disability management perspective, from a workplace health and productivity perspective, as well as from a human resources perspective, is something that is quite integral to an organization's success. And there's a few different perspectives that we can use when we look at work disability. I happen to be one of the people who wrote the CSA standard on disability management in the workplace. And we had very interesting discussions earlier on, because one of the perspectives that I tend to gravitate towards in the workplace is helping organizations understand episodic or chronic disabilities for individuals once they are already part of the workforce. So these could be temporary or permanent in nature. There could be functional limitations with regards to people's ability to do their work. Well, another perspective is, well, how do we employ people with existing disabilities and bring them into the workplace? Now, this is another strategy that is quite helpful for employers from a couple different perspectives. Number one, given a labor shortage or perhaps the need to employ as many people as possible, bringing in people who are disabled can actually help improve that diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect of the business, but also help people who may be chronically underemployed, and there may be poverty factors related to that as well. So there's two different ways that we can address disability in the workplace. So when it comes to helping organizations address and understand people who acquire a disability or a functional impairment in the workplace, this is the traditional approach to disability management. Absolutely critical for the future, especially considering where people are at with regards to mental health. So anxiety and depression, stress to a certain degree, burnout, rust out, these sort of factors that we know are impacting people's ability to do their work. And in fact, it could actually lead to a work disability episode, perhaps covered by workers' compensation, perhaps a short-term disability episode or a long-term disability episode. Now, we know that given where we're at within the current economic climate, perhaps a recession around the corner at the time of this recording, we've got climate change, that's a big issue, we have strife, we have significant amounts of inflation all over leading to food insecurity. There's lots of problems out there, and this is causing an awful lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, an awful lot of stress, and in many cases an awful lot of depression instances. So there is a significant push to help support people from a mental health perspective to perhaps intervene from an early intervention perspective to stop people from going off on leaves associated with a work disability episode due to mental health, as well as the physical health side of things. Let's face it, we are not the most healthy population that exists out there. We've got a lot of preventable chronic conditions that exist. We have cancers, we have cardiovascular disease, we have type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, musculoskeletal conditions, back pains, arm pains, these sort of things. And when you combine them with mental health conditions as what's called a comorbidity or perhaps even a polymorbidity, we have a lot of issues that employers today are absolutely going to need to address and help support in order to maintain that good connectedness with that worker and to make sure that they get the care that they need at the time that they need it and that the organization's needs are being met as well. Which is where the second component comes in, and that's actually hiring people with disabilities who have pre-existing conditions and incorporating them into the workplace. There's a great opportunity there to introduce employability with that particular segment of the population, and it's a win-win for everybody in that sense. So these are issues that are quite important for employers to consider as we move in to design and develop and support this workplace workplace of the future, because all the signs are moving in the wrong direction when it comes to people's health. We're not getting healthier, and so focusing in on prevention and trying to best support people as best as possible to address this, and perhaps letting people maintain where they're at and perhaps not get any worse, is a very solid strategy and approach that employers should be employing these days. So one of the most important things that has occurred over the past couple of years is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I have spent my entire career helping organizations understand the importance of investing in the health of their people. And unfortunately, we had to go through a global pandemic for organizations to truly understand how important the health of their population of workers actually is, and how important it is to support them from both a physical health perspective and a mental health perspective. So physical health perspective with regards to getting people up and moving, understanding the need to move your body, get your step counts up, get better at having quality sleep and good duration of sleep, as well as addressing and supporting mental health concerns. So this is addressing stress, depression, anxiety risk, as well as depression as a clinical state down the line. So there's many things that organizations can do to help address this that they haven't necessarily done historically. So this change was really fostered by the pandemic. Now, it has forced us to look at how and where people work to a considerable degree. So we now have people who work either fully remotely, so outside of a traditional workplace or office environment, where it makes sense, because it doesn't make sense for everything. You know, think restaurant, hospitality, transportation, healthcare for the most part from a primary care delivery perspective, manufacturing, those sort of things, very difficult to work remotely. But from a perspective of all the other workers out there, there's a tremendous amount of work that can be done remotely outside of a traditional work environment. Now, we also have hybrid types of work environment where people spend a few days in a traditional office and a few days working remotely, most likely from home. And then there are certain organizations who are trying to bring everybody back into that office environment, just like they were back in 2019. So the pandemic has ushered in different ways of supporting people, primarily through digital strategies and making sure that people are connected. You know, Zoom meetings and GoToMeetings and Teams meetings were used sporadically prior to the pandemic, and now it's a mainstay. Everybody is quite familiar with them within the office environment from that perspective. So we have these different places and these different ways in which people are working, which has forced us to rethink how we support people from a health perspective. I mentioned the mental health side, I mentioned the physical health side before. Now, these types of approaches are quite useful to be included into the overall workplace health and productivity strategy and approach, simply because it's a reflection of the nature of the reality of what we see right now in our workplaces. So organizations have to be mindful. They have to be using and leveraging digital strategies to help people be the best that they possibly can in the work environment. Because in many instances, employees today, they're shopping around. They're looking for the best benefit plan. They're looking for organizations that support their mental health. They're looking at employers who respect and support their health to a much more significant degree than they did 5 years ago. Now, one of the most important aspects of this type of working environment that has been received a fair degree of research over the past couple of years is this concept of shifting from a 5-day traditional work week to a 4-day traditional work week without a decrease in the compensation, which is quite interesting. There's been a few tests over the years. Microsoft Japan has done it. There's been a bunch of other tests globally. And in fact, very, very recently, the UK study results were released from the University of Cambridge as well as Boston College in the US. And they had a tremendously large population of individuals that they followed for a 6-month period back in late 2022. Now, what they found was almost the exact same thing that we've seen in other studies that were done. Health goes up rather dramatically. So people's risk of encumbered by stress, the anxiety levels, the risk of burnout goes down, turnover goes down, people feel better, there's better work-life blending or work-life balance, and most importantly, from a business perspective, there is no change in productivity, and in fact, in some instances, productivity goes up or stays the same, and interestingly, profitability and top-line revenue actually goes up as well, particularly in the UK study. So historical approaches to or misgivings or barriers that were brought up around the fact that, hey, perhaps we shouldn't never test out a 5-day work week simply because it doesn't make sense. We have all this office space that we need to capitalize and use. But when you think about it, many people today are in this type of working environment are working remotely for part of the time anyway. So those arguments don't really hold. Plus, we have the ability to support these people. And then when we look at the experience of people who have trialed and tested out the 4-day work week, we see that this is actually something that holds tremendous water. It's much better for the individual's health. It's better from an organizational perspective. There are means to control costs, and you don't necessarily have that impact on productivity or profitability or revenues for those organizations who collect those. So this is quite exciting, and this is something that will be a future pillar of work as we move forward. Another issue from a work disability perspective is the issue that surrounds people who had bouts of COVID-19 disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, there is a substantial portion of the population that actually has functional limitations tied to their previous disease. And so things like brain fog, extreme fatigue, the inability to smell, the inability to taste, people being in a position that isn't necessarily as they were prior to becoming infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus and developing a severe case of COVID-19. Now, this is something that's quite interesting from a work disability perspective, because things like anxiety and depression and back pain and type 2 diabetes and managing these conditions and preventing these conditions is something that we know a lot about. We have a lot of research, we have a lot of data, we know the natural sequelae, we know how people end up with a condition, we know how to treat it, and we know how to bring them back to work safely. Now, when it comes to COVID-19, this is a new disease. It's quite difficult to truly understand all the ramifications and understand what things are going to be like in a year or 2 years and 3 years. We don't even know if a lot of these conditions and functional limitations that people with long-haul COVID-19 or post-acute COVID-19 syndrome exist, because it's only been a couple of years since we've had this. So this is quite important for us to truly understand and help support the workplaces of the future, simply because of the sheer volume of people who have these types of symptoms impacting their ability to deliver in the workplace and impacting their quality of life. So the next most important or item that should be considered when we're discussing the future of work from a workplace health and well-being perspective is what the future workplaces should look like and how they should react to an individual's workers' request or desire to work from a particular location. Also, when they are in a particular location, how do we best support them from a positive employee experience perspective? Now, this is a current buzzword that we're seeing a lot of with regards to how people interact with their employer and what that employer represents to them. So beyond compensation, beyond voluntary benefits, involuntary benefits, all these sort of things, there's this concept of culture and experience and how that individual worker is provided an environment with which to flourish. So organizations that are responsive and reflective of what that desire is are going to be much more successful in the future than historically organizations have been. Great examples are organizations that include green space in their facilities, if in fact you do actually have a facility where people go to. And of course, the support for people for exposure to green space outside of the working environment as well. You know, a quick 5-minute walk actually does a tremendous amount of good for you in between your Zoom meetings. And research is very supportive of this type of approach. In fact, there was some research that was published very recently that looked at exposure to green space in a few European cities. And it related to the fact that not only do you have or should you have the ability to see the green space, i.e. moving away from the cube farms that we've experienced over the past 30 years or so, but exposing people to green space from a visual perspective, and then actually giving them the opportunity to go outside into that has tremendous impact on mental well-being as well as physical well-being, because you're working at the same time. So when you layer on these sort of approaches and perhaps supporting people's ability to do that, perhaps even factoring it into the workday, it does have tremendous implications from the future of work perspective. Making sure that employers are cognizant and mindful of the fact that people are not robots. They need to get up, they need to move around, they need to interact. We're social animals. And so having these sort of capabilities within the working environment results in better improvements on the health side with regards to mental health and physical health, but also the psychological aspects, the teamwork, the cohesion, as well as the business imperative and the operations side of organizations, which is why we're employing people to do tasks and carry out roles to begin with. So these sort of things are quite important for the workplace of the future, simply because they are critical to maintaining who we are and to help us be our best selves. So one of the other considerations for the future of the workplace that should be considered when we're thinking about how to best design organizations or to shape cultures to best support people from a health perspective is the concept of satisfaction and engagement. Now, engagement, from a human resources perspective, goes beyond the concept of discretionary effort. So here we're talking about people who genuinely have an interest in the work that they do, and they show up. And a great example, I'm somebody who travels an awful lot to different conferences and to meet with different employers all over the world. And I'm very brand loyal to the airlines that I follow and the hotels and the rental cars. So much so that in every city that I go to, I know exactly what the script should be when I check into a hotel or when I check out a rental car. And you can tell right away which employees are fully engaged from a customer service perspective versus those that, I call them job owners versus job renters. The owners really want to see you satisfied as a customer. The renters really couldn't care less. They're just going through the motions, perhaps just there for a paycheck. Now, this is something that is quite important from a human resources perspective and workplace health perspective, simply because the desire has been for a long time now to get higher engagement out of people, to have people as engaged as possible, because engagement means great things for the organization. But highly engaged people they're sick less often, they tend to be healthier because they're taking care of their own individual needs as well as the needs of others as well. So this is quite important. Now, related to this is the concept of satisfaction, which is something that we're seeing a great deal of research in these days with regards to how satisfied people are with their employers. In the early stages of the pandemic, many people were quite happy with the way that organizations adapted to carrying out business for the most part in a very uncertain time. And so what we see now is that carryover effect moving forward, so that people are looking to their own satisfaction and trying to decide if that role in that organization that they're part of is actually something that truly drives their engagement and makes them happy. Now, there's a lot of research that has been done on this concept of satisfaction simply because it is now something that employers really want and should be looking at in terms of designing the future of work to make sure that they don't have high turnover rates. They don't have people moving for that next role quite readily if their needs aren't being met. And research has shown that people who are satisfied, they tend to be engaged, they tend to be healthier, they tend to be sick less often, absent less often. All those things that we try to focus on from a workplace health perspective and a well-being perspective are all encompassed within this concept of making sure that people are engaged and supported and satisfied in their roles. One of the other important factors that employers of today should be thinking about in terms of addressing their needs for the near future and the distant future is this concept of building resilience into the workforce to be reflective of the current needs as well as the future needs, particularly in times of disruption. And this is quite important, particularly given our current economic status. We've got, inflation, we have a severe climate crisis, we have conflict and strife throughout the world. We have an awful lot of issues that are impacting people's ability to manage and cope with all the daily stress and pressures that are placed upon them, particularly those in the younger generation, which, as we know, are going to comprise the majority of the working population within the next couple of years. People are ill prepared in many respects to deal with the stresses and the pressures of daily life. Plus, there's also the fact that if we include even housing as a good example, some people are under the impression that they may never own a home of their own. If you look at the proportion of people who are living with their parents after their education and move back in, it's at a generational high. We've never seen this many people doing this sort of thing. And the cost of living is so enormous and so exorbitant that it is quite difficult for many people, particularly younger generations, to truly manage everything. So one of the strategies that employers can use is deploying digital technologies or even in-person or face-to-face type technology or supports and strategies to help people build up their resilience, to give them that mental fitness or that mental toughness to be able to handle these types of stresses. Now, a really good analogy is your cell phone. Everybody has one. Everybody has battery anxiety, I'm sure, from time to time. I'm somebody who travels an awful lot. When I'm down in the 10-15% and I know I have an important call coming up, I'm searching for a place to plug my cell phone in. I've got that battery anxiety. Those of you who drive electric vehicles, absolutely battery anxiety. You're constantly worried, particularly in Canadian winters, with regards to how far can you truly travel and make it home safely. So this concept of using our electronics and looking at the battery and understanding where things are at is very applicable to your own body as well. We have our own body battery. If you think about it, during the night, during restful sleep, good quality sleep, that is when our battery recharges. And of course, you can extrapolate this onto the weekends if you have weekends off, or even onto vacations or paid time off as well. Those are recharge opportunities because the days that we have, they tend to be quite draining and there's a lot of stuff thrown at us. Now, when our battery levels are sufficiently low and are not able to get that recharge that we need on a daily basis, that has profound impacts on our health. It has impacts on our heart rate. It impacts on our stress levels. It's actually a risk factor for various chronic diseases, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, definitely related to these sort of things. And in fact, chronic pains and musculoskeletal pains that people exhibit. A lot of these things can be tied back into these sort of approaches. So we know that sleep is quite important. So we have to address this and making sure that people are getting that 7 to 8 hours of restful sleep. One of the things that I've been doing over the past couple of years is testing wearable devices. And I use these sort of things and correlate that with how much physical activity I get during the day, how much food I eat, the type of food that I eat, and as well as whether or not I ingest any alcohol. It turns out that alcohol ingestion for me wrecks my quality of sleep. And in fact, when I wake up the next morning, I don't feel rested whatsoever if I have 1 glass of wine or 3 glasses of wine. So that has a significant impact on my own ability to put up a fight the next day, if you will, and be resilient to those types of changes. So when we look at well-being strategies and how we can help support people for this, there's lots of different strategies that which we can use to develop resilient people, to develop mindful people, and help them deal with the stressors that exist throughout their working days, and to help them live better, more productive lives. So from a well-being perspective, there are programming approaches that are quite helpful. There's educational components. There are certain things, there's non-medical applications, so mobile apps, which will nudge you and help you develop certain types of behaviors which are absolutely critical to long-term success and helping you decrease your risk of burnout or being impacted by stress by building up your resilience and your ability to handle these sort of things. at the end of the day, really what we want to be developing are habits, because once we move into a state whereby we've got good quality, healthy habits, well, that's one of the most important things that we can do to decrease our risk of mental health issues as well as physical health issues. And these sort of things can be part and included within modern workplace approaches to well-being. So helping people truly understand habit forming, re-incentivizing, and supporting people as they move on to their health improvement journey. And there's plenty of different examples as to how we can actually help support people to do that. So education is one component, although education on its own doesn't do it. You have to be able to support it with perhaps incentivization programs. But you have to be careful to make sure that your incentive programs really work. A great example that was given to me a few years ago, I was speaking at an event in Toronto, and a woman told me that she participated in a health improvement event. This happened to be a behavior challenge whereby she needed to get a certain amount of steps into a certain amount of period, and then she was in competition with a lot of her coworkers, and there was some great stuff going on. Well, she ended up winning, and the prize or the incentive for her being in first place was lunch with the CEO of the organization, which to some people would be a great incentive, but to others who may be an introvert or maybe not care about things like that, they would be terrified. And this woman was actually terrified. She said at the end that was a disincentive. She did not want to participate in a health improvement journey or a behavior change challenge to try and get to the habits if the incentive didn't match and wasn't really appealing to her. So this is something that is quite important from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, and making sure that people's individual health journeys are in fact personalized and incentivized to really speak meaningfully to that individual person, so that when they do embark on a health improvement journey to develop those levels of resiliency or anything that is tied into that well-being strategy, they actually get good quality outcomes that are tied back into that individual's journey, and of course have the organizational success factors that are quite important to this as well. Okay, so in summary, when we think about how we help support employers today to plan for the future of work, we really must consider a few different things. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, making sure that our approaches to well-being are in fact inclusive and reflective of a modern, diverse workforce that we see today. So we have to be able to make sure that organizations understand the need for the personalized approach and making sure that their strategies are in fact reflective of these types of approaches. Now, also of great importance is the ability to include people who are disabled into the workplace, as well as help address work disability from acquired or episodic instances of work disability as well, through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also from a disability prevention perspective. Understanding how people are engaged at work and how you can use satisfaction measures and pulse surveys to understand where your population is at, and incorporate these data into how you help address things from a workplace wellness and workplace well-being perspective are in fact quite critical. And finally, from a resilience perspective, making sure that we're able to drive and deliver on building up people's resiliency so they can withstand the pressures of today and tomorrow is a very critical aspect that employers of today and those of the future will absolutely need to have in their toolbox with which to best support their people moving forward. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been my pleasure to provide these video sessions today. Thank you.